Hello and welcome to another edition of Inside Syria. I'm Hazem Sika. Well, as the world focuses its attention on the carnage in Gaza, the conflict in Syria has largely been forgotten, yet the three-year war has only intensified and witnessed its bloodiest phase just last month. Over 1,800 people were killed during a 10-day stretch in July. It's pushed the estimated total death toll in 3 years of war to over 170,000, according to activists. And that figure is set to rise, according to a Syrian defector. Now, the man in blue here, known only as Caesar, is a former police photographer responsible for taking pictures of dead and tortured activists. Caesar told U.S. lawmakers this week, though often through graphic testimony, of cataloguing strangulated corpses with deep wounds and burns, some with their eyes carved out. He says 150,000 people are still in Syrian prisons awaiting a similar fate. UN investigators say opposition activists are abandoning their groups in large numbers to join the Islamic State movement. The group is fighting against forces loyal to Bashar al-Assad, as well as other opposition groups such as the Nusra Front. Opposition groups accuse the Islamic State of undermining the fight against Bashar al-Assad by targeting them instead. The Islamic State controls large parts of northeastern Syria and western Iraq, including the city of Mosul. Well, for more on this, I'm joined by our three guests. From Beirut, we have Joseph Kechichian, senior writer at Gulf News. From Washington, D.C., Peter Neumann, director of the International Center for Study of Radicalisation and a professor of security studies at King's College London. And joining me here in Doha, Louay Safi, member of the opposition. He's a former spokesperson for the Syrian National Council. Welcome, all three of you. Joseph Kechichian in Beirut, if I could start with you. What do you put down the rise of Islamic State to? Obviously, there are a number of factors involved, since this is a group that has a control of large parts of Iraq as well. But as far as Syria, what do you put it down to?
Well, we should not really jump to conclusions, because this is a mysterious group, although they are claiming to be an outreach, if you would like, of so-called Al-Qaeda. I'm not even sure what Al-Qaeda is, much less what Islamic State or Daesh, as they like to call themselves, is all about. I think that we are in the front of a very interesting new phenomenon. We are seeing groups emerge left and right of frustrated young men who are involved in the struggles of their lives out of total frustration with the political environment in which they live. Specifically with respect to Syria, we have seen now this war drag on for over 3 years with no end in sight, and it seems that the Syrian oppositions, and I insist on oppositions because there are so many of them, the Syrian oppositions have really failed miserably to get their act together during the past 3 years, costing not just 170,000 killed, as you've said in your introduction, although this figure is probably much higher than it is, but with respect to approximately 5 to 7 million refugees that have spilled throughout the region, and with a regime that is in total denial, despite all of the difficulties that Syria has lived through during the past 3 years, the opposition has failed. Therefore, we see these groups emerge, whether it was Jabhat al-Nusra a few months ago or a few years ago, or whether it was some of the Islamic fronts, Al-Jama'iyya al-Islamiyya and others, and now we have the so-called Daesh, Islamic State, that is trying to enlarge the scope of territory over which it rules, including, but not exclusively, to Syria and Iraq. It would like very much to expand, but again, as I said, we really don't know much about all of these groups, and we should not be asked to swallow line, hook, and sinker all at once, because there is so much at stake here, and we know so little about these organizations.
Peter Neumann, what's your take on Islamic State? And I want to ask you about the point that was made in our introduction there, the reports from the ground in Syria showing that there is a kind of an understanding, if you will, or maybe there isn't, between the Assad regime and Islamic State, that their lack of action towards each other is somehow of mutual benefit, that there's kind of a Machiavellian strategy going on there. Is there enough proof of one to state that Assad is not deliberately not targeting these areas that are controlled by Islamic State, but is choosing to hit the more moderate opposition groups? Do you think there's any validity to that?
So ever since ISIS came into existence, which was about a year ago, there has been a ferocious debate amongst supporters of the opposition as to what to make of that group. Is it genuine? Does it represent a legitimate voice within the Syrian opposition? Obviously not. Or is it, and that's the other extreme interpretation, is it actually run by the Assad regime? I have not found a lot of evidence that ISIS is a creation and run by the Assad regime, but it's certainly true that ISIS has been, or the Assad regime has been complicit in the rise of ISIS. Whilst it is not controlling the entire group, it certainly has spearheaded at crucial points over the past year, or even a little bit more than a year, from attacks. Why is it doing that? It is doing that because these guys are so crazy. It is clearly in the interests of the Assad regime to see them come to power, because compared to ISIS, Assad suddenly looks like a moderate. And he can go to the international community and he can say, look at me, I'm the alternative, I'm the only viable alternative to these crazy guys who are now rising and rising. And that's why at crucial points in the past, Assad has actually spared ISIS areas from attack. Assad is immediately dropping barrel bombs on areas where more moderate secular opposition forces are taking control, because they really represent an alternative to his claim to power. ISIS is so crazy, it actually is positive for Assad to see them in charge.
Yeah, what about that point, Louay Safi, that the rise of Islamic State, or ISIS as they were formerly called, allows Assad to go to the international community and people inside Syria and say, look at what I'm fighting against?
I agree. I agree. Though, I mean, we have to look at ISIS in its formal and former, I should say, development. It was developed in Iraq during the American intervention in Iraq. It was among the major forces fighting the American military using IED, and it succeeded in many ways, really, to force the Americans to withdraw. And this force was supported by al-Assad then. There was a continuous support by al-Assad, who feared that the Americans might move into Syria. Now, as such, because of this collaboration, I think the Assad regime thought it would be very convenient, for the very reason indicated by Peter, that they maybe their movement into Syria, into the liberated area, would complicate the work of the FSA, the Free Syrian Army, and the moderate opposition. And in fact, they have succeeded really to complicate that task, because now the opposition is fighting two fronts without any meaningful support from established democracies. So I think the failure is not only the failure of the opposition, though I will concede that there has been some failure, but the failure also of the international community, particularly established democracy led by the United States.
I want to talk a little bit more about the perceived failure of the opposition, Syrian opposition groups, of which you're a member. And I know Joseph Kechichian touched on this, as saying that they need to get their act together. Is that not a valid criticism, that there seems to be a lack of unity there, and as well a lack of a real connection with what's happening inside the country?
It's a valid criticism, absolutely. And this criticism is now taking place also within the opposition itself. But we have to realize that this opposition was put together in a very short period of time, and is made of all really spectrum of political spectrum within Syria. You have from the right to the left. I think the opposition has created some credible organization, but it lacked absolutely any meaningful support from the outside. While the regime is supported, with a great strength by the Iranians and by the Russians. The Americans and the Europeans, and to some extent, or to a lesser extent, I should say, the Gulf countries have not come forward with the same zeal to support the transition in Syria. And I think that's where the tragedy lies.
Okay, we'll expand on that now, because meanwhile, the main opposition group outside the country, the Syrian National Coalition, remains, as we said, divided. Prominent members have been sidelined since the election of Hadi el-Bahra. Bahra replaced Ahmad Jarba as president in July. Since then, members such as Louay Safi, who was the SNC spokesman, have found their influence recede. Others say the group is in total disarray. So you were formerly a spokesman of the SNC, and now you have left that job. Just explain to us why you did that, and is that connected with this perception that they lack organization and they haven't really got their act together?
Well, I don't want to put it completely on the shoulders of Hadi al-Bahra, who is really trying to do his best within a very tough and difficult situation. I think the problem lies in the tension even within the support group. You know, the European and American allies are not on the same page, nor the Arab allies, and so there is some inner tension and disagreements that has reflected within the opposition, because the opposition, and that's where I think I disagree, you know, with the tactic and the strategy, has relied completely on the international community and the Arab League and friendly countries to come to its aid. Those countries have not been able to do so.
All right.
And mainly because the United States have concluded that it should not provide this opposition with advanced weaponry with which it can defeat the regime. For many reasons, I don't buy all of them, but some of them might be credible. But many of them are just pretexts to try to keep, you know, this fighting going on the way it is. And I believe it's a very strategic error that will come to bite and backlash on those who have contemplated this scenario.
All right, well, let's put that point about the international community then to Peter Neumann in Washington. Could countries like the United States and other nations be doing more to give support to viable opposition groups in Syria?
I tell you what I hear in Washington, D.C. It's not necessarily my opinion, but that's what I hear. The feeling here amongst policymakers is that the moment at which American or Western support could have made a difference on the ground has passed. That moment would have been in 2012, when a decision was taken by the U.S. government, for whatever reason, not to go in with more support. Now, 2014, the situation on the ground has changed so much that a lot of policymakers here would feel very uncomfortable giving the kind of weapons that the Syrian opposition wants into a situation where really extremist groups are so dominant. And only last month, and this was big news in America, only last month we had all these reports about bomb makers from AQAP in Yemen traveling to Syria in order to develop new ways of blowing up U.S. aircraft. And of course, you have to consider that U.S. policymakers are hearing these news, and at the same time, they are hearing the requests from Syrian opposition forces for more weaponry, and they are putting one and one together, and they are saying, no way, because our weapons are ending up in the hands of extremists. That is the situation in Washington, D.C. right now. I personally do not necessarily agree with it, but I think it is going to be very difficult getting through that situation.
Joseph Kechichian, when we talk about IS and the kind of support that they're drawing in Syria right now, how much of it is really ideological? I mean, obviously, this is a very hardcore group, but are all of these young men necessarily believers in this kind of ideological idea of creating an Islamic state or an Islamic caliphate, or is it more about that they want to be on the winning side? They're more comfortable fighting with a force that is seen as being well equipped and that is winning battles right now. Is that a fair assessment?
It is a fair assessment, and probably both of these explanations. Obviously, fighters who have been at it for the past 3 years would like to be on the winning side, and they are seeing that the opposition forces have not really been able to score valid victories, if you would like, on the battlefield. Therefore, the hope is that the IS now will go ahead and accomplish something worthwhile. But I think it's important to stop this game after 3 years of blaming Westerners, blaming Arab leaders in the Gulf for not providing enough assistance, and that is the cause that has led to the rise of ISIS, if you would like. I think that the Syrian opposition has really been its own worst enemy from the very beginning. And the reason and the best evidence for this is, in fact, the creation of ISIS during the past year. ISIS did not happen out of the blue. It didn't just land from Mars. It is part and product of the conflicts in both Syria and Iraq. And it is the result of the failures of the oppositions in both countries. To a certain extent, it is true to say that the Iranians and the Russians have been supporting the regime in Syria, and therefore the regime has been able to put up a fight against unarmed or poorly armed opposition forces. On the other hand, when there is so much bickering, when there is so much disagreement, this reminds me of World War I conversation between the four leaders and the French general at that time, Clemenceau, the president. Clemenceau essentially keeping quiet in one of these powwows that they had. And at one point they turned to him and say, "Why aren't you saying anything?" Says, "Because we're going to lose this war when everybody is a general." The problem with the Syrian opposition is that they're all generals. There are no fighters. And you cannot win a battle like this when everybody wants to have his say and everybody wants to put his foot forward. I think that ISIS is the best evidence that, in fact, the opposition has failed. And now there is an ideological component that has been added to it. That's true, certainly. We are seeing with Caliph Ibrahim claiming all these wonderful ideological features, if you would like. But at the end of the day, that is not really the primary motivator. The primary motivator is to see this war drag on and on with no end in sight. And these young men believe that they're going to make a difference. Time will tell whether they will make a difference. But at this point, it doesn't look sure for them that they're going to make a difference. They will have to put up a tremendous amount of fighting if, in fact, they're going to expand into Damascus, into Baghdad, into the real centers of power. We're very far from that event.
Louay Safi, I know you want to respond to some of that. And the point that was made there, that there's too much bickering among the Syrian opposition, too many generals, not enough fighters. What do you say to that?
I would say this is the narrative put out by the White House and bought by many journalists, and I don't blame them because they don't have first-hand information.
But where's the evidence that that isn't the case?
Let me tell you what the evidence. Let me tell you. You know, the opposition almost was able to penetrate into Damascus 2 years ago, or 1.5 years ago, when the White House, because the strategy of the White House is to try to reconcile the Assad regime with the opposition, playing a very, very tactical game that really does not succeed in the context of the Syrian conflict. So they want Syria to have sort of reconciliation. And every time they see the opposition winning, they withdraw all ammunition. So the ammunition will dry completely. There is no ammunition, and the fighters are forced to withdraw back, while the regime continues to receive more ammunition from the Russians and from the Iranians, and even fighters coming with no objection from the White House. The Hezbollah was able to send tremendous force into Syria, and the White House did not really object in any serious way. So I think this game, this strategy of trying to keep it balanced, they cannot balance it this way. And unfortunately, the winner out of this balance between the regime and the opposition has been the ISIS. And ISIS is not a new creature, it's an old one, and of course is going to now to haunt even the regime that gave it initially support. And of course the regime would like to get now the Western support in addition to the Russian support to try to argue that it is going to win that fight. If I might say one more note here. I think the strategy of the Americans is completely wrong, because they continue to support dictators that keep complicating the Middle Eastern political scene. started with Iranians, even in the 50s, and continue constantly without changing this strategy, even today. And as long as they are going to support dictators, we're going to see more complication in the Middle East and more radicalization. So not only the Iranians will have their own theological regime, and soon we'll find these regimes popping up throughout the Middle East. And therefore, I think this is quite stupid strategy to follow.
Peter Neumann, you made the point a little bit earlier that a window of opportunity was missed on the American side to take any meaningful action as far as Syria. When we look at the testimony that was given by that former photographer for the Syrian regime that we mentioned earlier, in which he showed some of those gruesome pictures and just cataloguing the extent of torture and imprisonment of activists by the regime, what sort of impact did that have in Washington? Did it have any impact at all?
It does, of course, and no one is doubting the tremendous and terrible suffering of the Syrian people. I mean, everyone has seen these pictures or has seen pictures like these. Amongst policymakers in Washington, D.C., everyone is aware of what is happening in Syria, both in abstract terms and in concrete terms. The problem is that whatever policy option you put towards them, they are not convinced that it will actually improve the situation. And responding to the earlier point made by the previous speaker, I think he is giving the U.S. too much credit. If you believe that the U.S. actually has a strategy, I think you are mistaken, because I do not think that the U.S. government has implemented a carefully calibrated strategy in Syria trying to balance forces and keeping this conflict going. I think it has struggled from goalpost to goalpost, and it has changed its strategy at various different points, and it clearly does not know what to do. And part of that is the lack of unity amongst the opposition, and part of that is the sense that they do not know what would actually improve the situation on the ground in Syria without strengthening the Islamic State and extremist groups. I think the human suffering is beyond doubt. What is lacking for the policymakers in Washington is a viable policy option where you could actually see things improving on the ground without bringing extremists to power.
So, Joseph Kechichian, how much is this down to what's seen as a kind of lack of leadership in Washington?
Well, I think that it's very easy to blame Washington, and certainly Washington has been indecisive in Syria. After all, let's not forget that President Obama has drawn a red line in the sand, so to speak, and he has asked Bashar al-Assad to leave power, and he has not followed up. And perhaps that the opposition feels that the aid promised was not delivered on time. And one can make a list of all the grievances against Washington. But at the end of the day, this fight is not about Americans fighting for the liberation of Syria. It is a Syrian fight, fighting to change the regime under which for 40+ years most people have lived, and presumably they would like to change their own government, their own system of government. So they would like to receive aid from outside powers, but this is their fight, and this is the Syrian dilemma. And the Syrians have got to get their act together, so to speak. I say this out of real affection to the Syrian opposition. That should not be in Istanbul, it should not be in Geneva, it should not be in Washington, but it should be inside those liberated areas of northern Syria, so that it can be on the ground, so that it can have an on-the-ground effect. Now, of course, around the 600 miles border, or 600 kilometers border, sorry, with Turkey, you have a great deal of relationships going on back and forth, and the northern Syrian economy is presumably entirely now integrated within the Turkish economy. So therefore, there are some things that could be done for the opposition. They could make deals with the Turks to actually have a physical presence inside Syria. That is where it's going to make a difference, not in Washington, D.C., and not in Paris.
And on that, we're going to have to leave it. Thank you to all of my guests, Joseph Kechichian, Peter Neumann, and Louay Safi. Remember, Al Jazeera has extensive and continuing coverage of what's happening in Syria on air and online. I'm Hazem Sika. Thanks for watching. Goodbye for now.